In the beginning there was only a big and gaping void. It was everywhere and nowhere. Into this void two powerful entities appeared who eventually became known as the higher gods. Fardos the creator and Uman Zathrath, who combined into himself two unequal halves. One of these halves was Uman the wise, a benign god who was endowed with divine intellect, while Zathrath the destroyer was the other dark half. These were the two halves of a single enigmatic entity, and although either of them had the ability to act on their own, as if they were independent, they were not. They were bound by an eternal bond that could never be broken, and their destiny was the same. No one knows where these higher gods came from, or if they always existed and finally woke up from eternal sleep. But somewhere along the way decided to create a universe. After several failed attempts to create the first genuine creation, they awakened another entity, maybe even more powerful than the gods themselves. However, this seemed to go unnoticed by the gods, who ignored this fact and continued to create other entities, like other lesser gods, elements, and the creatures that existed and exist today in TIBIA. But perhaps, the biggest mistake of these gods was to ignore the entity that one day woke up from their sleep.
Thousands of years ago, the gods had managed to create their first creations on the world of TIBIA. Various races populated the vast plains, which turned into fire due to the unleashed war. This war had an origin and was based on a war between gods for the power of creation. The evil gods and their minions fought for supremacy and the destruction of life, while the benign gods relied on their creations to respond to the attacks of the creatures guided by Zathrath. It was then that the gods of good decided to create creatures that had more intelligence than strength, which could shrewdly respond to the attacks of the evil god Zathrath as minions. The great race of the Yalahari was created. They were one of the most advanced and gifted races that were created in the God Wars. The Yalahari lived on a remote island east of TIBIA, on a continent we know today as Oromond. In this place they discovered the use of a substance called gluth, which will lead to technological advances through steam. However, due to their curiosity and repudiation of the Great War that was tormenting the world at that time, they decided to carry out research and experimentation in order to understand its nature and origins. The Yalahari questioned the whole purpose of fighting a war which was not theirs. However, the war and their enemies managed to find the remote island where the Yalaharis lived. Their cities, inventions, and experiments were smashed. Total chaos gripped the city and the Yalahari decided to emigrate to a new destination. Thus, they withdrew from the raging battles and traveled to one of the northern islands, building their magnificent city which they called Yalahar. With a few instruments and experiments that they managed to rescue, they continued to investigate the origins of the world, and that was when they got a big surprise. By analyzing the very structure of the universe, their Mago scientists became aware of a missing factor in all worldviews, calculations, and sciences. All their research hinted at something to be missing from the big picture, something that had to exist as their calculations clearly proved, but yet undiscovered and seemingly eluding. Feverishly, the Yalahari concentrated all efforts and experiments on studying this phenomenon. After countless years of research, the most brilliant minds of the Yalahari approached a first success. At the point of this breakthrough, some of the involved scientists simply turned insane when their minds suddenly grasped a piece of the incomprehensible. The Yalahari eventually managed to establish an approximation theory of a place between reality and non-reality, a place that should not be. And that place was not void, but inhabited by one thing which our words could only feebly describe as an entity. From one moment to another, the sky clouded over, the earth trembled and the Yalaharis were paralyzed. Nobody could move, they had their arms open, leaning on their knees and their blank eyes pointed to the sky. A voice whispered to each of them within their consciousness. This voice was not a literal voice, rather it was messages inside their heads which granted them forbidden knowledge unknown to all other creatures back then. Within a few minutes the Yalahari knew things they should never have heard. They would never have suspected that it was the beginning of their downfall. This entity was not an ordinary entity, rather it could easily challenge the elder gods. But having no physical form or influence in TIBIA's world, it was trapped in its own origin, a place unknown to most creatures, the dream dimension. The Yalaharis, not knowing how to name such an unknown entity, decided to give it a name, Varifor. Varifor was perfectly aware of his existence and of our universe. Suddenly it also became shockingly clear to the Yalahari that by giving the entity a name, they had also given it some more substance in our universe. The Yalaharis realized this fact and quickly stopped naming Varifor by his name. However, it was already too late. Varifor had already gained the necessary power to be able to influence the world of TIBIA. Slowly, the Yalaharis began to lose their sanity, their conscience, and even their nobility. Tainted with forbidden knowledge and unable to resist that influence, sisters and brothers turned against each other, and in a night of slaughter, most of the once proud race was wiped out. The remaining Yalahari knew about their irreversible corruption and decided to part from this world. The corrupted Yalahari left their city in the custody of their servants and vanished from history forever. The races that we know today as ancients, such as dwarfs and elves, began to feel forgotten by their creators. Thousands of warriors died day after day and the gods were not present. Many of them, seeing that Zathratha's forces were taking control of the land, decided to emigrate to more remote places in search of refuge and peace. Thus, the elves were divided into groups according to their castes and abilities. Each elven caste had their own characteristics and customs. Some were warlike and aggressive, other castes possessed great magical powers, while other castes were mystical and thoughtful. The caste called Sindarin decided to stay and fight against evil. This caste was the oldest of all the elves and their bravery and vigor was admired. Also, they possessed great magical powers and relied on their skills and strength to face war. Unfortunately, that was not enough and the war ended up destroying his greatest warriors. Among them was Praila, daughter of the stars, Desavar, the sword dancer, Krinia, the silver tongue and Morsha, the ravager. These particular elves were part of the first elves created by the gods, who met their deaths in battle. Due to their bravery, honor and greatness, these 4 elves took their place within the 7 elven high lords known as celestial paladins. The caste called Teshiel retreated in the early days of war to hidden refuges, not as a whole caste but only in small family groups. Their hideouts were additionally protected by strong illusionary magic and offered them peace from the madness around them. These elves developed due to meditation and a special philosophy in the art of dream magic, dramatically enhancing their initial abilities in the decades. So they began to exist almost permanently in a state of dreams, only rarely appearing now and then amidst the other elves to give them advice and try to convince some of them to join their way of life. This is how they taught their brothers, the Senath, the art of dream walking. As the war grew more and more fierce, these visits became less and less frequent until they were almost a myth, even for elven kind. Another elven caste called Senath took refuge in the valleys of the city we know today as Liberty Bay. They lived there for a long time, far away from the rages of war. Life went on as usual for some time, the elves minding only their own business, as if pretending there was no war at all. But of course, they knew that their settlements were inevitably going to be found by the enemy sooner or later. For this reason, the most powerful elves of those castes decided to weave spells guided by their dream-walking abilities. Their intention was to create a totally new world, a world in another existential plane other than the physical plane, in which only they could inhabit, far from war and live in peace forever. Thus, one day the elves concentrated their magic and began to use their mana for the ritual. The elves knew that such a move could cost them their lives, but it was their only hope of escaping the war once and for all. For many hours the elves concentrated their magic and ether emanated from the ground, which slowly began to open a gap between dimensions. The ritual consumed so much power that the volcanic area near the island began to tremble. The sky clouded over and the volcano erupted. Suddenly, the fabric of space and time was torn apart and a huge explosion was unleashed. The land near the island was totally destroyed and the entire geography of the place was left in pieces. However, the elves achieved their goal. They created a world of dreams in which only they could inhabit. The elves who managed to enter the dream world spread out, creating their own worlds, taking pleasant dreams from mortals and turning them into substantial objects and giving shape to their own children. One of these elves created a city called Faerist, in which he fashioned his own creations. He built a world that he always dreamed of with magical, sentient and aesthetic creatures. This way, he spent hundreds of years developing his ability to weave dreams to a point never seen before. Unfortunately, realizing his potential as a weaver of dreams, the elf began to have ambitions that were not his nature. Years later, this elf joined other elves who had also fallen prey to ambition, deciding to create a new elven caste, called Shaglair. Their ambition reached such a point that they rivaled Zathrith's favorite pets, the demons. While they did not consider themselves Zathrith's allies, they did not consider themselves his enemies either. The demons referred to these elves as dream stealers, dream vampires and other similar names, but normally they were simply known as dreamers. Various battles between the Shaglair and demons occurred during this time, solely to test their power. Over time, they decided to create their own city, which they named Roshamel. Here they carried out a new technological invention that would be their greatest pride, the construction of the Dream Catcher. This device would be based on building extremely powerful weapons through stolen dreams so as not to have rivals on the battlefields. Not satisfied with this, they also decided to experiment creating a new creature based on nightmares, the Nightmare Beast. One day a request came to the council, which consisted of building prisons of dreams. The true purpose of these prisons was to create a trap for a handful of demons who betrayed Zathrith. These traitors were the demon princes, who joined a third power, unknown even to the elves. Zathrith's new rival and responsible for the demonic betrayal was called Varifor. His corrupting power was so great, that he managed to convince the gods' first elite troop of demons. However, Zathrith's second troop of demons, the Ruthless Seven, remained faithful to their master. In this way, in a joint effort between demons and dreamers, the demon princes were trapped in prisons. However, the princes were so powerful, thus many demons and elves were totally annihilated during this battle. In an act of desperation, an elf unleashed the Nightmare Beast, which distracted the demon princes long enough to release all of the energy stored in the Dream Catcher, causing an explosion on a catastrophic scale. Many demons, princes and dreamers died instantly. Some remained alive and fled, others still remain prisoners in the depths of Roshamel. Another caste called Chalabdil took refuge from the war on the ice islands northwest of Karlin. This caste in particular was usually a bit taller and stronger than elves of the other races. There they carried out their life passively, however they had artifacts and magic of great power, which did not go unnoticed by Zathrith. In this way, the evil god decided to send a horde of demons to attack the elves' glacial fortress. The elves hid underground to defend themselves. The battle claimed the lives of some demons and elves. The elves, seeing themselves overwhelmed by the demonic hordes, decided to use one of their magical relics in an act of desperation. The leader of the elves took the Frostheart Spire and with great force threw it to the ground to destroy it. The Frost Spire had so much power stored within it that it caused a magical ice storm that turned the entire geography of the island and the creatures that inhabited it into ice. Most of the demons and elves were trapped under a blanket of ice forever. The evil god in his anger tortured for decades some elves who were left alive, performing magical experiments on them, disfiguring their physical appearance and creating a twisted and retrograde mind. In a moment of reflection, Zathrath called his son Brog to create a new race from these elves, which would be the most fearsome and warlike race known to this day. The Orcs.